Good morning, everyone. Hello to those present in the room and those present through Zoom. My name is Sonam Kachru. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Religious Studies. My subject, narrowly construed, is the study of Buddhist and Indian philosophy in ancient South Asia. I want to tell you a little bit about our speaker today, introduce her fascinating talk, but not before saying a few words about the event of which this is a part, and not without offering a few quick housekeeping notes and without offering thanks. For our Dome Room audience, please silence your phones if you haven't yet. I'm really hoping that I did so too. We are videotaping this event, which is synced to our Zoom live stream. I say we, but this is really due to the magic of Ashley, whom I'll thank in a minute. When we reach the Q&A portion of our event, it is important that our in-person audience members wait to receive a microphone from one of our student assistants so that your question may be heard by our online audience. And to our online audience, please post your questions in the Q&A box, and we will do our best to incorporate them into the program so that you too may be present, however virtually. Today's talk inaugurates a 2-day workshop sponsored by UVA Democracy Initiative's Religion, Race and Democracy Lab and the Page-Barber Committee. I would like to acknowledge the Page-Barber Committee, co-chairs Jennifer Geddes and Isaac Reed, for generously granting us the funds for this event. And my special thanks to UVA Democracy Initiative's Religion, Race and Democracy Lab, the co-directors Martine Halverson-Taylor and Curtis Schaefer, for supporting the ideas that led to this workshop and for providing significant funding and staffing resources in that order, without which this symposium could not have happened. Thank you for all the support. And without Ashley Duffalo, wizard in residence at the lab, none of this would be possible. My sincere thanks to her. Beginning today and over the next 2 days, an anthropologist, Professor Luhrmann, a classicist, Professor Johnston, and a philosopher of religion, Professor Clements, will present their work in conversation with one another and with UVA faculty, students, and an extended online audience. Our guests will discuss voices and how people use social practice to shape inner worlds and moral purpose, how ancient handbooks of spells in Greek dating to the first 6 or 7 centuries CE narrate a world into being into which one can immerse oneself. They will discuss how to think about the difference between practices, technologies, and hermeneutics of self in the path-breaking work of Michel Foucault. This symposium has roots in conversations I was lucky enough to enjoy with my colleagues Andrei Petrovich and Ivana Petrovich from Classics and Janet Spittler from Religious Studies in the years before the pandemic. Now that's a dating convention that's rather tricky, right? There's a before, an indefinitely prolonged during, and only dimly an after. So sometime before the pandemic, we imagined a large conference on practices of self in the ancient world, non-parochially imagined, from Athens to Patliputra. This, during the pandemic, is a descendant, with modification, of those conversations and those hopes. Given how fruitful our conversations have been, at least to me, I hope my colleagues would find them to be as fruitful, conversations across disciplinary and linguistic borders, I hope that participants today and tomorrow, on stage and off, will embody the animating conviction of the Religion, Race and Democracy Lab. I quote from their website, "New understandings arise when we bring the excellence of our different disciplines into a highly creative and collaborative environment." End quote. As our first speaker, Tanya Luhrmann, once put it, the deep insight here is that talking to oneself is not as powerful as talking to another. End quote. And what's true of persons is true of disciplines as well. What we want to talk about with one another and with all of you is the following: our experience of ourselves, which, as the French philosopher Michel Foucault once said, it seems to us, no doubt, to be that which is original and immediate, but we have to remember that it has been constituted through historically formed practices. And what we believe we see so clearly in ourselves is given to us via techniques. The American writer Ursula K. Le Guin noted that all of us have to learn how to invent our lives, make them up, imagine them. We need to be taught these skills. We need guides to show us how. If we don't, our lives get made up for us by other people. End quote. What is true for our experience of ourselves and our lives goes for the worlds we take ourselves to inhabit, the ones we find apparently ready-made for us, the ones we narrate into being, the ones we enact in our rituals, the ones we dream ourselves into. Now, few know this, as well as our speaker, our first speaker, Professor Luhrmann. Tanya Marie Luhrmann is the Watkins University professor in the Stanford Anthropology Department. She has done ethnography on the streets of Chicago with homeless and psychotic women and worked with people who hear voices in Chennai, in Accra, and the South Bay. She has pursued fieldwork with evangelical Christians who seek to hear God speak back, with Zoroastrians who set out to create a more mystical faith, and with people who practice magic. She was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2003 and received a John Guggenheim Fellowship Award in 2007. Her book, When God Talks Back, Understanding the American Evangelical Relationship with God, was named a New York Times Notable Book of the Year and a Kirkus Review's Best Book of the Year, forgive me. She's also the author of Our Most Troubling Madness, Schizophrenia and Culture. Now, the New York Times and the Kirkus Reviews can say what they will. My advisor, Stephen Collins, now passed, told me that I would be absolutely mad not to read her work. A slow learner, me, it took me the most recent book to finally cure me of this illness. Professor Luhrmann is most recently the author of the fabulous How God Becomes Real, published in 2020. It is a miracle of a work on presence. Professor Luhrmann will speak to us today on voices, so I wish to introduce you to her work with her own voice. In 2017, in an interview with Martin Fortier, Professor Luhrmann described her work thus, I quote, I define myself as an anthropologist with deep interests in psychology and a commitment to using psychological methods to explore the questions ethnography cannot answer. The broadest question that interests me is how the world becomes real for people, particularly when what is real for them seems unreal to others. I'm interested in the texture of reality and the way it changes for people and in the quality of individual experience. End quote. I'll only bore you for 3 more minutes before letting you hear our esteemed guest. Professor Luhrmann here situated herself academically in a contemporary intellectual universe, but inspired by her own non-local fieldwork. Were I able to plot a world of non-genealogical connections, to imagine a world of creative, unfettered juxtapositions, unconstrained by distance, by times, or language, I would seek to position Professor Luhrmann with another fabulous female scholar practitioner, a philosopher queen in a rather literal sense, a deeply unconventional and fearless explorer of mind through complex embodied techniques, the philosopher Lakshmi or Lakshmimkara Devi, who lived perhaps in the 10th century CE in the Swat Valley in the northwest of the subcontinent, one of a multi-generational lineage of creative students, many of them women, working across genres and disciplines to create new possibilities for Buddhist and Indian philosophy. Why would I so position Professor Luhrmann? Because Lakshmi, at the conclusion of a very enticing short work that one could translate Making Non-Duality Real or Accomplishing Non-Duality, says this: it is a fatal thought, a thought that kills, to think that there is no presence in any of the items constitutive of our life world. A striking thing to say for a Buddhist of her persuasion, for she emphasizes throughout the lack of ontological grounding of things. Things viewed ontologically, she says, have no self, no independent essence. But to ignore presence in connection with them, as so many of her co-religionists were apt to do, to ignore the presences in our life world, she thinks, is an existential and academic mistake. Talk of absence, Lakshmi says, though it sounds sophisticated, is a manifestation of vulgar, untutored opinion, Philosophy 101. It's also a kind of existential suicide. We cut ourselves off from what matters. Presence requires careful handling, theoretically and practically speaking. If we resist treating presence ontologically as a thing or any set of things, how are we to bring it theoretically and experientially into view? How shall we attend to it? This was the question Lakshmi and her students asked in their experiments with embodied and enacted limits of consciousness, in their practice of making presence real for themselves. In Sanskrit, imagination and cultivation come from a root that means bringing into being. Another continuity with Professor Luhrmann's work. So fellow travelers with Professor Luhrmann along the edges of experience, whose goal is to taste and experience embodied varieties of freedom and presence. For Professor Luhrmann, this kind of a project is also ultimately a humane question, along with a methodological one. I quote her now before introducing her and her talk. I want to know, Professor Luhrmann says in the same interview, about the differences between people and the way that individual experience shifts and slides. And the clearest way to see these moments of difference are in the edges of experience, in voices, in visions, the world of the supernatural and the world of psychosis. What drives those experiences has a lot to do with the way people make judgments about what we call mental events. You might call me an anthropologist of mind. You can see why we wanted to begin our conversations on selves with an anthropologist of mind, one cool enough to talk to a pre-modern theorist like Lakshmi. In today's talk, Professor Luhrmann will argue that voices or the sense of being called by another are at the heart of human experience. Our minds are deeply social, less interior, inner universes, more like dinner parties with noisy guests. So I invite you now to listen, though as well-behaved guests, silently until the Q&A, and I invite Professor Luhrmann now to speak in the hope that it may give rise to what the Indian philosopher Abhinavagupta imagined thought, even the thought of God, to be at its best. Polyphonic, a conversation structured as an address to an internal other, always an other, and response, a flow of questions and answers without end. But before that, we must listen to Professor Luhrmann. Please. Thank you.
Goodness. Thank you very much. That was an utterly lovely introduction. So it's such a pleasure to be here. It is, sorry, let me start my timer. So I've lost my mouse. I've lost my mouse. You see it? Oh, great. Now we can, okay. Okay, I've recaptured it. You have a beautiful campus. I'm sure you know this, but it's the first time I've been here, and you are very lucky to be here. Thank you for having me. I'm going to talk about, this, as Sonam said, a human experience that is kind of weird, but it is at the heart of both religion and madness. And by the end of the talk, I'm going to try to make the argument that it provides us a kind of deep insight into the way that humans relate to their own experience of thought. I'm going to talk about the experience of feeling as if you are being spoken to in the absence of a human speaker. And this is sort of the rock star of voice hearers, Joan of Arc. These experiences, so she heard 3 angels or maybe just God talking to her. These experiences really matter because they're evidence of spirit. Spirits speak. That's how you know that they're there. They're often invisible. So Enkidu spoke to Gilgamesh, Yahweh spoke to Abraham and then to Moses. The angel Jesus spoke to his disciples after his death. Gabriel spoke to Muhammad. In any account of prophecy and in many origin stories, there is a voice. There is a speaker who creates, who commands, who asserts into the void that there is a creator who has authority to whom you should pay attention. Voices have mattered in history. So in the 4th century, Augustine was struggling in the effort to be a Christian. He couldn't convert. He really wanted to. He talked about himself as being torn against himself, and he couldn't do it. He was in a moment of extremis. He ran out of his house into the garden, threw himself at the foot of a fig tree, and heard God speak to him. And that voice helped him to convert and change the history of Christianity. Our rock star, Joan of Arc, 15th century, a peasant woman, heard God speak to her, and what she heard was so compelling and so persuasive that she was able to go to the King of France and get him to give her an army, and she won a battle, and that battle may have saved her nation. Closer to home, Martin Luther King, on the eve of the Montgomery bus boycotts, was afraid. He'd had death threats against himself and his family. He wasn't sure what to do. He went to his kitchen, he sat and he prayed, and he heard God say, "I will be with you." And he went forward. Voices matter to ordinary humans. This next person is a young woman who graduated from UC Santa Cruz, perfectly reasonable school. Couldn't get a job. Best job she could get was the morning shift in 7-Eleven. And one day, she said this woman came in and she looked like she'd been up all night. She looked like it had been rough. She threw her stuff on the counter, 6 packs of Miller Lite, some cat food, and a food product of some sort, donuts, I think. And she looked at me and she said, "Hey, can you get me a carton of cigarettes?" And I'm thinking, excellent. This is what I wanted to be doing with my life. So I turned around, I rolled my eyes, and I started thinking my judgmental thoughts. In that moment, I literally heard the voice of God say to me, "Do not judge this woman. I have created her in my image, and I love her." And poor woman, I almost fell over. I'm trying to give her change, and I'm like, whoa, the voice of God spoke to me. I have been changed ever since. This next woman was in Chicago. It was pretty early on in my relationship with him, with God. I just had wonderful devotions and worships, and I just felt so close. I went out, and it was the most god-awful day. It was icy rain and gray and cold, and it was sleeting, but then he just graced me the rest of the morning. The bus showed up right away, which it never does. I was reading, and I missed my stop to get off, and I heard God say, audibly, "Get off the bus." I looked up and I hollered, and the bus actually stopped. I just felt that intimacy all morning, like when you go from holding a new boyfriend's hand to kissing him goodnight. So how common are these experiences? So these are statistics about the audible experiences. And if you show up with a clipboard and you ask people questions, roughly 3 to 10% of people will say that they've had some kind of auditory voice experience. When I sit with people, I sit with charismatic Christians, and I really talk to them, the number is more like 1/3 of people have said that they've had some experience when God's spoken to them in a way that has a hearing quality. Asked differently, you can get the rates go even a little higher. If somebody has lost somebody, then 70 to 90%, depending on your country, say that they have heard or seen or felt the presence of their lost loved one in the months after the death. So these experiences aren't so uncommon, but they don't happen to everyone. And so how come? Well, one answer is that God only speaks to some people. And I don't think that's necessarily wrong. I'm not opposed to the idea that God is speaking. I do think that if there is a God who is speaking, God probably talks to more people than are able to hear. And then an anthropologist can say something about the process that enables some people to hear. Another explanation is that only some people are mad. So, the general kind of madness I'm talking about is psychosis. This is a condition in which people have distorted thoughts and perceptions, delusions and hallucinations. The most dramatic and difficult kind of psychosis is called schizophrenia. 60 to 80% of folks with schizophrenia hear voices. People hear voices in other conditions as well. And this is what it feels like for some of them. So this is a young man with schizophrenia who told me that when he was driving, he'd hear voices from the other cars. When he stood on the pavement and a car drove by him, noises would slough off the car's trunk like water, and they'd kind of resolve into voices, like a bubbling stream of jeering, laughing words. When the room was noisy, individual sounds would break off and form themselves into voices. When the room was quiet, he heard less, but a muffled echo would become a man in the other room. When he moved his leg would speak to him. When his stomach rumbled, it became an angry reprimand. The voices were like the aftertrace of color, as if when he waved his hands through the air, it left language in its wake. And this was horrifying language, words that sneered and drawled. And he knew these voices were symptoms of an illness, but they sounded real to him, and he could not dismiss the possibility that they were people. So some people want to argue that this is the real thing, forget God, and that some people have a lot of psychosis, and the psychosis is just distributed in the population. So some people just have a little bit, enough to have a few experiences. I want to offer today a different explanation, or at least present a different kind of pathway. And this is the argument that people relate to their own thought in different kinds of ways. They relate differently because of their own proclivities. I think madness is a kind of proclivity, a kind of individual trait or orientation of the body. Because of the practices that they do, the way that they learn to pay attention to their thoughts, and because of the place where they're located, and the local beliefs about thoughts that shape the way they're attending. And as I tell this story, I'm going to start from the presumption, whatever we think about the nature of God, that there's some story here about voices that have their origin in thoughts that come to be experienced as not me and not outside. So I'm telling a story about a process through which inner experience somehow pop out into the world. So as Sonam said, I'm an anthropologist. I've been studying the way people talk to invisible beings for a long time. My first book was about people who tried to create intimate relationships with Caradwin and Cernunnos and Artemis and other folks. I spent some time trying to understand Zoroastrians who tried to recreate a mystical relationship with their god Ahura Mazda. My book on evangelical Christianity focused in on a huge number of Americans who seek to have an intimate back and forth relationship with God. We call this charismatic evangelical Christianity. I followed up that work with work in Chennai in South India, and in Accra in Ghana in West Africa, in the churches, the huge neo-charismatic churches in those countries. And I've spent a lot of time in other faiths. Got initiated into Santeria. Hung out with a lot of folks. I've learned a little bit about how Oliver Sacks used to do some of his research, because people now write to me and they say, you must interview me. And so I do. I know a lot about psychosis. So I spent over 1,000 hours, a lot of time, on the streets of Chicago, in a neighborhood in Chicago that has the densest concentrations of persons with schizophrenia in the entire state of Illinois outside of the jails. I followed up that work by talking to persons with schizophrenia and other kinds of psychosis in Chennai and in Accra, and more recently in China. And what I do, because I'm an anthropologist, is I talk. I talk and I talk and I talk. So I can spend more time than most psychiatrists can spend in talking to the person I'm trying to understand. I talk to people for an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, a lot of time. And I can talk more loosely and with more probing than many psychologists have been trained to explore. And what I'm doing, I call comparative phenomenology. I'm looking for this object. I'm trying to look at the phenomenon of the voice. But I'm trying to figure out how this is unique and different for the person that I'm talking to. I'm trying to be prepared for the fact that they've had an experience I've never encountered before. But because I've talked to so many people, I'm constantly exploring in comparison to other people. So what I'm doing is saying, somebody's telling me about an important experience, and I'm saying, and did you hear that with your ears? Did you turn your head to see who was speaking? Was that inside your head, or was it kind of here? Where did it come from? Did it have a voice timbre? Was it a man or a woman? Could you tell? Was it soft? Was it loud? So I do a lot of hanging out. So what have I learned? And I should say that I think about this as in the phenomenological tradition of William James rather than Husserl and Heidegger, in this kind of more clinical orientation to exploration. So what have I learned? Well, my sharpest comparisons have been between the voices of madness, people who meet criteria for schizophrenia, and the folks who would call themselves evangelicals, particularly these charismatic evangelical Christians. And when I compare those dozens and dozens of interviews, first of all, I think there are three qualities of voices that really stand out to me, although I should say the more I talk and the more the scholars like me talk to folks, the less and less clear-cut all of this becomes. First, these experiences have a not me quality, and this is in some sense more important than their auditory quality. Some of these experiences are auditory, some of them not. For each of these experiences, people will say, I could tell it wasn't me. It didn't, and they say different things. It didn't sound like me. It didn't come from me. It didn't have my voice. There was something that really stood out. I knew it wasn't me. And then often they run out of words. There's this blurred boundary quality. Sometimes it's super clear. The voice came from over there. I heard it the way I hear your voice. Absolutely audible. Sometimes people will say, oh, no. In my mind, completely internal, not audible at all. A lot of people say audible in my mind. I heard it with the ears of my mind. I don't know. It was in my mind. No, I heard it with they just got confused. There's something kind of messy about the sensory quality. And these are minded experiences. They are not like listening to music. There is an agent, and the agent is intending to talk, directing their intention towards the person who hears. That's true of all voices. I see two big patterns. The folks who meet criteria for schizophrenia, typically what they hear is frequent. They can have these experiences many times a day, many times an hour. They can live in a beehive of sound. That what they hear is like, I call it extended. There are lots of words. Sentences, conversations, paragraphs, constant commentary. And often, what they hear is pretty lousy. You're stupid. You should just die. You're worthless scum. I mean, stuff like that goes on and on. Not always. The Christians without psychosis, when God speaks, typically when I'm talking to somebody, they can remember a couple of experiences. Maybe one, maybe three. Sometimes people say happens once a month, but they can't remember. When they remember it, they remember a few words. I will always be with you. I love you. Start a school. It's startling. It's not distressing. These experiences often happen not more often, not always, in automobiles, in buses. C.S. Lewis was saved on a bus. And somebody's driving along. God speaks out of the back seat and says, I love you. They know it's God. They're startled as anything. They pull over to the side of the road. This is a great experience. In general, my default is to say the more audible, the more frequent, and the more negative, the more I'm likely to think that is part of the psychosis column. But the lines aren't super clear, and there are many complicated people. It turns out that there are many Joan of Arcs. So on the left, you have St. Anthony surrounded by demons. This is Martin Schongauer's image. On the right, this is a woman I met in Palo Alto. They have a lot of voice-hearing experiences, many more than the Christians do. The Christians without psychosis I've just been describing. It's kind of we don't know how many there are. It's kind of hard to do. I don't really trust our surveys, but there are kind of a lot of people like this. Not tons, but Joan was not unique. So now I want to do a deeper dive. Oh, that's not me. Okay. It's happened. I forget to turn my own phone off. All right. So I want to now do a deeper dive into how voices might be trained by practices of attention. I'm going to suggest that there are three kinds of training of attention that really stand out to me. One is attention to the inner senses. I call it inner sense cultivation. You could call it mental imagery cultivation. It's careful mental imagery attention. There are what you could call attachment practices, which Sarah Ilse Johnston might call narration, kind of a practice of talking, just talking to people. And there is a model of mind which imagines the mind as porous to the world, open to the world. And that's more of a belief, all these practices change the frequency of these events. I could tell this story through talking to you about writers. Dickens talked as if he heard dictation. Could talk to you about the way that people who want to hear the dead speak learn how to have a relationship with their wife or husband after they've passed. I'm spending a lot of time these days with tulpomancers, which is an internet community in which people create invisible friends. They have no metaphysical commitments. They come to experience the tulpas as talking back. Sarah might tells a version of this story by looking at the ways that myths work in the ancient world and the ways that the gods become and the myths become real for people. And I'm going to take you through a story about evangelicals. So these are people, maybe 25% of the country is this kind of Christian. It's a lot of people. And in this kind of Christianity, people want an intimate relationship with a God they think is wonderful, a very loving God. And they come to these churches, and if they don't know how to do this, the church will tell them how to experience God vividly. They believe in God, but they walk into the church and they say, God doesn't talk to me. Will you pray for me? Because I know that God talks to you, but God just doesn't talk to me. So, what do you learn if you come to a church like this? Well, you learn that some of the things that you take to be your own thoughts aren't really your thoughts. They're God talking to you. And so you start with the idea that the boundary between your mind and the world, it's like a mesh, at least for God. God can somehow get through. Then you've got to learn that you've got to pick out God's thoughts from your own thoughts, that this is a skill you've got to acquire. And here's a woman who's explaining this. She's saying, when people are praying over me and I'm just receiving it, and all of a sudden I hear, go to Kansas, which is where her parents live. Because I was debating whether to go to Kansas, but I hadn't been thinking about it within a 24-hour period. It makes you want to say, where did that come from? So the church community kind of invites people to say, to look for thoughts that are spontaneous, that stand out in some way, or the kinds of things God should be saying. They'll talk about testing it. They're teaching you sort of search principles for how you'd pick out those thoughts that might be God. They tell you to practice, which is called prayer. Huge emphasis on praying, praying, praying. Talking to God in your mind, sometimes in the presence of other people, sometimes out loud in the presence of people, but pray, pray, pray. Some versions of it make this very clear that prayer is to a person. So this is a woman who talked to me about date night with God. I'll set aside times where I'll have date night with God. I can go to the park and I can take a Subway sandwich with me and just sit there. It's almost like a conversation then when we're talking about his children, we're talking about what's going on in my life and what he's doing in the world, that sort of thing. Guys sometimes talk about beer night. This is not just a girl thing. And after some months, that new person will say something like, I recognize God's voice the way I recognize my mom's voice on the phone. So, in a church, in this version of Christianity, in all walks of faith, there are many, many manuals that teach you how to do this. There are hundreds of manuals that teach you how to hear God speak more effectively. How more effectively to hear God speak, and so you can listen to what he has to say to you. In these manuals, it's pretty clear that this is not supposed to be an auditory experience, even though they sometimes give auditory examples. So here's one manual that says, look, God's voice normally sounds like a flow of spontaneous thoughts. But sometimes God does speak audibly. So here is a woman who says, the Lord spoke to me clearly in April, like May or April, to start a school. And I say, you heard this audibly? Yeah. Were you alone? Yeah, I was just praying. I wasn't praying anything really. I just was thinking about God, and I heard start a school audibly. I immediately got up and I was, okay, Lord, where? She never did. But what she was doing to get to that point of hearing God tell her to start a school was cultivating her inner senses. So when she's talking to God, she's walking with God, she's sitting with God on a park bench with God's arm around her shoulders, she's maybe sitting in Jesus' lap, she's trying to see Jesus' face, she's kind of, maybe she's standing in the throne room, she's trying to feel the power of God's presence on her cheeks, and she's practicing attachment in that she's just narrating her day at God, with the idea that she's kind of also having a dialogue with God. So one of the things I saw early on, both with my pagans or witches and magicians and with my evangelicals, is that when people start to come into this world, over time they will say casually, in an aside, and then I start asking people about it, their mental imagery becomes sharper. There's something that's changing about the landscape, the mental imagery landscape of their inner world. The thing they have to imagine, God, starts to feel more like a person to them, and they also report more of these funky sensory, quasi-sensory experiences, which they associate with the thing that they're practicing. So really my first foray into psychology, I randomized a group of charismatic Christians either to these inner sense cultivation practices or to lectures on the Gospels. And the rule was half an hour a day, 6 days a week for a month. When we gave them computer exercises and gave them surveys and we interviewed them, and the folks in the prayer condition, when they came back, were more likely to report sharper mental images, more sense of God's presence, more sense that God was a person for them, and more voices and visions. It wasn't they were having voices and visions all the time. They reported maybe one, and not everybody had this experience. But it was more common in the prayer group. So this is my proposal, that there's some kind of general, non-mad pathway, to use a metaphor for a bodily process, through which attention to inner events leads to those events coming to seem more external and more in the world real. And I think that pathway is facilitated by the way that people think about their minds. And so I'm going to take just a few minutes to talk about the Mind and Spirit Project, which I ran for 3 years just before the pandemic, thank heavens, in which we had a big number of people involved. It was Templeton funded. This is our core group at dinner, talking amongst ourselves. What we did was that we had experienced field workers, people who knew the language, knew the country, go to 5 countries, the States, Ghana, Thailand, China, and Vanuatu. And I wanted to talk to you about 2 things we observed. We observed a bunch of stuff, but I'll talk about 2 things. We gave people the absorption scale. So this is, I find, a completely fascinating scale. This has 34 items. Only 1 of them refers to religion. Only 2 of them refers to presence. You can take the presence items out. It still works. You give this to people and you say, does the statement describe you? True or false? Sometimes I feel and experience things the way I did as a child. I can be greatly moved by eloquent or poetic language, stuff like that. And in previous research, I had found among Christians, among university undergraduates who were secular, the more truths somebody marks, the more cool, weird experiences they report. And I think that's at the scale, I'm still trying to understand the scale, I think it's picking up an interest in vivid mental imagery and a kind of joy in vivid mental imagery and a willingness to suspend disbelief. But we're still exploring that. I also wanted to talk to you about porosity, which is something else we began to explore. The idea that the mind-world boundary is permeable in non-ordinary ways. And I want to take just a little bit of time to persuade you that these are intuitions that you have about your own mind. So you can ask a lot of things about the experience of thought. You can ask, where is your thought located? And that then, particularly for secular Americans, that answer is easy, it's located in your mind. But it's extremely easy, even for secular people, to have the intuition that after somebody dies, something mind-like kind of continues. Maybe you don't even believe it, but it feels intuitively plausible to you. You probably think that your thoughts are private. Nobody can read your mind. But you might have the intuition that twins, in moments of extremis, maybe they know what's going on with the other person. You probably have the intuition that your thoughts are yours. They have the quality of what James called a quality of myness. But we also talk about being inspired, the idea comes to us, it popped into our mind, the anger overwhelmed me, I don't know where it came from. There's a lot of language we use to talk about thoughts that come to us as if we don't own them, but they came from outside. And we generally, you don't think that your thoughts can do stuff unless you, the doer of the action, follows the thought. But you probably feel icky to sleep in a bed in which somebody had recently died. Not because of infection, because of maybe something had slipped out of that body into the mattress. You might have the intuition that you can feel the anger in a room after the people who have been fighting have left. You might not believe that, but it's available. And what I want to suggest is that different cultures elaborate these ideas and can make them into particular beliefs that often get incorporated into religion. I don't think porosity is the same as religion, but it's a kind of undergirding in many religions. A soul is a mind outside the body, for example. Witchcraft is an anger or an envy that leaves one body and hurts another body. And what we found in this project is that no matter where we went, no matter how we asked the question, we had rich, open-ended fieldwork interviews. We hired research assistants and made them stand at the equivalent of the DMV and ask people questions. We gave university undergraduates surveys for them to fill out. No matter how we asked the question, no matter where in the world we went, in fact, pretty much no matter where in the world we went, the more absorption somebody attested to, the more they reported voices and other odd spiritual events, and the more porosity beliefs they attested to, the more they reported these odd voices and other odd spiritual beliefs. And that's where that came out. So I think there's some kind of story here about the way you judge your thoughts, and your judgment changes the event. I can see this. There's much more to say about this, much more work to do. But I think we can see that if the thought has more sensory detail, it's a good candidate for being judged as coming from the outside. If the thought feels more spontaneous, you're more likely to judge it as coming from the outside, as not being authored by you. If the thought feels more as if it's someone else's, you're more likely to judge it as if it's not your own, it somehow came to you. And I'm just going to give you a little Mickey Mouse example of this, the way that judgment changes experience. I'm going to play a version of speech, which many people, when they first hear it, think sounds a little bit like birds. Very silent birds. How has this happened? What? It's fine. Let's see if this. Okay, well, never mind. the cool demonstration is that you would hear this sound that sounded very much like birdsong. For some percentage of you, it would sound like birdsong. And then okay, birdsong. But I was going to then reveal that if you listen carefully, it's actually the first line of the Lord's Prayer. And it turns out that once you hear the first line of the Lord's Prayer, you can never hear it as bird sound again. It actually changes the way you experience the event. So now I'm just going to take a little bit of time to say, okay, I think that madness is a kind of proclivity, but I think it also responds to this kind of training of attention that we see in these other ways of experiencing voices. And so this is the paper. And let me just say very quickly that I did a project with psychiatrists in Chennai and in Accra, and we tried to be really careful to make sure that, tell you what we did to try to, they did the interviews, I went in and redid a bunch of interviews. I tried to see whether we could, in doing the interviews in Ghana, I went in and first did the interviews in English, and with a research assistant, some of them were in Chui, and then I sent her in, a Ghanaian woman, to redo another set of interviews to see whether the effects would be greater than just the presence of a white foreigner in the country. And what we found is that these folks with schizophrenia in 3 different countries had, in some sense, this is not a romantic story. They're all ill, they're all struggling, they're all clearly have problems, recognized as having problems, but the American voices are a heck of a lot more violent. So almost all of the American voices, almost all the Americans talked about their voices as being full of violence, and not one American in this first study said that their dominant voice was positive. Chennai, people hear their kin. Their kin can be pretty annoying, but their kin mostly tell them to clean up, to do chores. They're kind of like much less violent. When the voice is really mean to them, I mean, some of the voices are violent, I get it, they are. But like the thing that's really dreadful about these voices is sex. So, the voice will get onto the bus with somebody and tell the entire voice, only heard by the voice hearer, that they know that you're masturbating. You're a gunda because you masturbate. And so that's kind of striking. In Ghana, they hear God. And so this is not uniformly true. This is like half the sample. But they say things like, if I hadn't had these voices, if I didn't have God talking to me, I would not have been able to cope with my problem. And both in Chennai and in Accra, and actually have done more work in Cape Coast now, people are more, even if they don't like that voice, they are more likely than the Americans to experience the voice as a person, as somebody who has a relationship with them, with whom they can interact. Now I want to go back to the Jones. So remember the Jones of Arcs, more frequent voice hearing experiences, that third group. I'm beginning to publish this work. In Ghana, where I spent some time in conjunction with the Mind and Spirit Project, there are spiritual experts called a Kongfu, often thought of as the traditional practitioners in the region. They have this very kind of marked quality because Christians will say they consort with demons, but on the other hand, they're also, sometimes Christians will use their services. They live in a world of many gods. So there's a great God, but there are many different gods. There are gods of rivers, there are gods of trees, there are local deities, and the Kongfu make relationships with a handful or more of these gods. They talk to them in an ordinary, everyday way when they're walking down the street, but they also have these altars at which they will present goods, and the person who wants to consult with the Kongfu will bring something plus money. A Kongfu will give that to the god and then ask the god to answer the question that the client brings. So there's a cultural model about who becomes an Kongfu. And this is what everybody more or less agrees is who becomes an Kongfu. the God will call, often out loud, often when the person is about the age at which, in America, people who develop schizophrenia. Their first break, it's called. When the God calls out loud, the person will be unable to function, they'll be possessed, they'll fall over, it'll be very distressing. The person who is called does not want to be in a komfu, because to be in a komfu, you have to drop out of school, you have to wear a sheet for a year, you can't wear shoes for a year, you're not going to earn as much money as if you actually finish your education. And so the struggle, the person who's been called often looks as if they're going crazy. They go to a trainer, to a master, who trains them, tells them how to hear the good gods and to avoid the demons. You must learn who is speaking and how to call. The training involves going in and out of a kind of a funky trance-like state. If the training works, the person should love the gods, and if the person rejects the training, they can go mad. I actually met a couple of people in the hospital who said they'd rejected the training. So let's see how this goes. All right, so my team in Ghana, they interviewed 40 Akomfu and 40 charismatic Christians, and 18 of those folks said that they heard a spirit speak more than once a week, just pretty frequently. So I arrive in Ghana for a month. I interview not 18 of these people. I interviewed them pretty carefully, and at the end, I play them a track. This track is 45 seconds. It's made by a woman in this country who carries a diagnosis of schizophrenia, and she made a track to represent her and her colleagues' experience of hearing voices. So let me see if I can play this. Okay, let's try it this way.
I came for you because you are the one. It's you. You are the one I came for. Stop. You are the one. Stop. It's you. It's you. It's you. It's you.
Look at their eyes. Look at them. Their eyes are full of disgust.
You have the way.
You smell. You are disgusting. They're looking at you to see you, and they see everything you do, and you are disgusting. Hey, stop it! Stop it now! Don't touch that. Don't touch it.
So the characteristic qualities that this track is trying to capture, and again, there's enormous variation. There's a hissing quality. There are commands. There's a good voice, and this track, pretty soft. I came for you, you're the one I came for. And there's a pretty mean voice that seems like a dominant voice. So I had this track translated into Chui, which took something, and we played it to, after the conversation, I played it to these folks. And what I was struck by, both in the conversation and in their reaction to the tracks, there were different kinds of people in these groups. So here's a woman who, and none of them have been hospitalized. Or she visited the hospital once, but she's not understood to be ill. She's a very successful Akomfu. She becomes an Akomfu late when her business fails. She behaves as if she's mad at that time. She clearly has auditory events right now, a lot of auditory events. She has a lot of negative auditory events. She hears snakes hissing at her. They're so auditory that sometimes she gets confused about what she's hearing, what the spirit is saying, and what's really happening in the world. Her neighbors speak to her in disembodied ways, and she's pretty odd. Here's somebody who's like Mary, but not quite. He said that the track was exactly what he heard, but he didn't hear it very often. So he said that it was sort of, every 3 to 5 days. Clearly indicated that he was hearing auditory events even now. He's highly competent. He runs a kind of local organization. But when he was 14, he began behaving so oddly that his aunt told his mom to take him to the hospital, and she took him to a kung fu training instead. And so there's this cultural model in which people have, people think that they're going crazy. Not everybody really tells that story, even though that's part of the model. He clearly did. This woman didn't. This woman kind of recognized the track, and she thought it was kind of interesting. She thought the whispering was kind of interesting. But she mostly talked about seeing the gods. She was never frightened by the gods. She loved hearing them talk with each other, but she really described them like imaginary friends. And I thought that she was talking to me about a vivid, imagined world. And this woman said that the track she'd heard, that was a convocation of witches. She'd never heard anything like that in her life. Thank you very much. And it turned out that when I was talking to her, she actually didn't have many of these experiences. She kind of had experiences of God that were more like dreamlike, on the edge of sleep and awareness. And she wasn't particularly fussed about the difference between what was in the mind and what was in the world, which is why she was so insistent on their auditory quality. And I would say that I see something quite similar in the conversations I'm beginning to have with mediums who also talk to the dead. They talk about their experiences a little differently. They present themselves, they have a professional investment in having active relationships with people who are talking to them. But again, there are different kinds of people. When I sit with people, some people are like, yes, my spirit, drive around Iceland with, somebody was from Iceland, I drive around the backcountry roads with him, he talks to me out loud, absolutely, sometimes he's a little weird, and other people they're using this language to describe their ordinary thought experience, and there's nothing that stands out to me. I would say these people, the Kung-fu and the mediums, are also using these similar kinds of practices. They're using inner sense cultivation. They're paying attention to their inner worlds. They're narrating their lives to the gods. And they absolutely are committed to the idea that their mind is porous and can receive information from the outside, and they can send information outside. And so that's what they do. So what I think I've argued is that there are different pathways for these experiences, but that even despite these different pathways, and there are probably more than I've described, both for psychotic and non-psychotic folks, practice and belief about the mind, your local cultural beliefs about the mind, seem to shape your experience. Why do we care? Well, one of the things that is unfortunately true about our American world is that we are very bad at treating psychosis. We treat it as a biomedical condition. We are committed to treating it with medication. I am not opposed to medication, but I think that what I see in these practices should invite us to think more actively about the use of psychosocial interventions to teach people to relate to their voices. More fundamentally, I think that it's super easy for Americans to imagine their minds like this, as if we have an infinite, invisible universe that's full of our memories, utterly private, utterly bounded from the world. And that's not the way our mind evolved, right? We probably have minds because our cognition evolved in order for us to figure out what other humans were doing. That's clearly an advantage to us. And it's not really the way that we experience the mind. I think we experience the mind much more through people, as that kind of dinner party Sonam was describing. So we come to an awareness of our mind through this intimate relationship in which we become aware that other people have different wants and desires than our own. And in fact, I think when you start examining your own thought experience, first of all, you see that you have a lot of commands, a lot of little tiny commands: eat this, don't eat that, run now, don't run, study now, don't study now, say this, don't say that. And you probably have a lot of experiences of other people's voices. I think people vary. Some people are very comfortable thinking about these as memories of parents or important others. Some people are much more, hear my mom's voice all the time. And I think what I am seeing in the way that voices are cultivated is, I think it allows us to see this process through which we are pruning and honing and trying to manage the inner cacophony so that all of us seek to have more of these good, positive, supportive inner presences and less of these more demonic presences. And I think that's really the work of faith, and it's the work of therapy, that it's working with the sort of the voices in your head to, if you're in a faith position, you're able to come, if you're lucky, and if your church is helpful, you're able to experience God as a helpful, more loving presence in your life that kind of pushes out the others. And that can also happen in therapy as well. So I will leave it there. Thank you very much. Yes. So don't speak until you have a mic. Yeah.
Testing. Is this working? Yes? Thank you so much. It was absolutely fascinating. And my question is really to be completely honest, I did a test from How God Becomes Real, and I failed spectacularly. I think I had like 2 positives.
You mean the absorption scale?
Sorry?
The absorption scale.
The absorption scale, yes.
Yeah.
And I started wondering, why that is, why so low. And I ascribed that to my atheist, socialist upbringing. So my question is, I have many questions, but I'll ask 2. One is, have you tried to talk to people who hear voices but are atheists? Do they just immediately self-diagnose as crazy? Or how do they qualify these voices? That's my first question. And my second question is, with your work with evangelical Christians, how frequently do they hear what they identify as the devils, the demons, the Satan? Does that happen? Are they trained to ignore those voices and attune themselves more to the God? How does that work?
Great question. So the questioner said, look, I flunked the absorption scale. What about that? And the first thing I would say is that statistics are a very crude measure, and these surveys are very, very crude. But she was wondering whether people who are atheists are more likely to flunk that scale. I think that, I don't know, that I haven't seen so much, but I do think that there is a kind of inhibition in many secular settings certainly to suspend disbelief, to kind of let yourself go. So I think that there is an interaction with the culture. You asked 2 questions. First of all, do atheists hear voices? And second of all, do Christians hear devils and demons? And the answer to the first is that yes, but they do often discount them. And I think that I don't really understand this process. This gets into the weeds of neuroscience. But I think there is a invitational flourishing of these experiences, not that it doesn't necessarily feel that way. They feel sudden. They feel very sudden. Am I doing the right thing? Oh, sorry. But there's a great collection of like the Happold Penguin Anthology of Mysticism. Has all of these famous mystics, and then in the middle it's got a couple of ordinary folks, and one of them reports a mystical experience, describes a mystical experience, and says, "At the time I didn't know what to make of it, so it just kind of disappeared for me. It just wasn't there." So I think there is something in the way that people allow the experience to happen. Secular Americans have many fewer experiences. In fact, Americans in general have fewer spiritual experiences than many people of other countries. You can think that's good or not good, but it does seem to be robust. Do Christians hear demons and devils? The Christians that I was spending time with, I knew somebody who saw a demon, and I think I knew a couple of people who heard demons, but I was not spending time with a lot of people who were focused on demons. They sort of, the church believed in demons, but the demons weren't so relevant to people's lives. So my experience was more talk about gods. In Ghana, charismatic Christians talked more about hearing demons. So I think there's a very social shaping of the interior landscape.
Wonderful talk, of course. My question takes us back to antiquity. We have in the Iliad, the Odyssey, and other works of literature descriptions not so much of people hearing gods, but phrases such as, then some god put courage into him, or then some god put an idea into his mind. And sometimes it actually says which god is doing it.
Yeah.
So we're meant to imagine that Achilles or Odysseus or whoever feel something happening to them, but it's very seldom, if ever, identified as an actual voice. So I wonder if you have parallels for that.
Oh, so the question is in the Iliad and the Odyssey and in other works of antiquity, there's more talk about God putting courage rather than God speaking. Although, Julian Jaynes would argue that in the Iliad, the gods take the place of thought for folks. There's a lot. There's a lot that is kind of ambiguous, and there is certainly a lot of language about God changing experience. And when you talk to, so with my Christians, I was more focused on voice. I mean, that's not entirely true. I've been going over the transcripts where we've been interviewing tulpomancers, these young people usually who talk to invisible friends, and their friends will come to life. And as that happens, they don't have a language of the friend putting, the human's emotions into them. They talk about coming to experience that some of their emotions really belong to the friend. So, no, forgive me. I do think that, the Christians will talk about God changing who they are. They tend not to talk about it as in a dropping stuff into the soul way. But it's a really interesting question. I need to explore that. Yeah. There's a question back there.
Oh, thanks. Is there someone? Sure, thank you. Thank you so much. That was such a thrilling talk and put so many things into perspective. Very moving as well. I was struck by so many things, one of which that I wanted to ask most directly is what do you think the contributing cultural factors are to the distinction between the US participants, whose voices, not a single voice was positive, versus Chennai, where the voices were about sex? And I'm thinking about this from the perspective of Michel Foucault, but to follow up on Sarah's point, I'm also thinking about this in the perspective of late antiquity, especially with the early Christians who have inherited this model of psychomachia, where they have the good angel and the bad angel, but there's always an interplay. And so thinking about the bad, right, the demonic, as taking such center stage in some cases to the exclusion of the positive is one question, and then the second is about sex, shame, prohibition, taboo, like what is it about what's happening right now that you think might economically or politically or culturally differentiate the United States experience from the Chennai experience of how they culturally code these voices? Okay, so those are great questions. One of them is what's going on culturally to make the experiences in schizophrenia, the voice experiences in schizophrenia, different in the different cultural worlds. I do think that there's the encouragement in secular mainstream America to imagine the mind as bounded is very powerful.
and it has a powerful impact on schizophrenia. It has a powerful impact. I mean, there's a lot to say. I think that there's a sense that when people hear a voice in the States, even if they're Christian, which many of my interlocutors were, it's they get scared of the voice. The dominant meaning of the voice is "I am crazy," and the voice also shatters the individual person in their mind. So I think many Americans have what I think of as a citadel model of the mind. What we think is really important is who we are. It's our identity. And we sit there, nobody else gets in. But it's also not so, connected to the body and the world. It's just kind of there. And I think when the mind feels as if it's shattered, it is terrifying in this country in a way that it is a little less terrifying. It's terrifying everywhere, but I think it is deeply terrifying in this country. I think that's one reason why there's so much violence. Another argument you could make is that we live in a more violent culture. There are records out of a Texas psychiatric hospital describing voice hearing in the 30s and the 80s, and the voices in the 80s sound a lot less violent. They have many more household commands. I think what's sort of constant in the voice hearing experience is a litany of often householdish commands. In the States, this is a broad claim, but the violence tends to overwhelm the household commands. Most people they were reporting lots of commands, but they weren't reporting commands to clean up and do chores. They were in Chennai, they were in China, they do in Russia, in sort of a northeast part of Russia. So there's that. I think that the question about sex is a good, deep question, I think much more complicated than the material demands. I think, this is Sonam, this is his domain, but I would say that sexuality is just imagined differently in South Asia. It's very overt. There are many conflicting, powerful ideas about sexuality in which there's this eroticism that's very overt and great control over the expression of sexuality. And if your voices are kin, then violating the expectations of your kin sexually, I think is just a big thing. So but that's a guess. We actually just published a paper on that, but it's a guess. I'm struck.
Thank you for a great talk. My question is about the sort of social aspect of the ways that people condition and establish these voices. So in charismatic Christianity, there's a sense that there's a definite social aspect and an aspect of that all of the people in this community are hearing the same voice of God. And as we consider, as you ended your talk in a ways we can understand these voices in an American context in a non psychologizing them way. Is there a similar social aspect that we should look for, or a way that we can establish like a continuity between people that are hearing these voices in a non faith frame sort of way? I don't know if that was very well articulated.
So that's I think that it would be fair to phrase that question as, does culture play a role in the way people experience voices outside of faith and outside of Christianity, or outside of faith and outside of psychosis?
Yeah. So if we want to engage with voices that we are experiencing that we're not saying that these are voices from God, that these are have a secular origin, and we don't want to make them into this is psychosis.
Yeah.
What is the sort of source of that I can understand my voice, the voices I'm hearing, as related to the voices that someone else is hearing in a social way?
So The two examples that I've so how do we understand these voices as in their social context, say outside of the faith context and outside of the psychosis context? So one of the things I'm really struck by are these groups of writers and these young men on the internet called tulpomancers. So writers, probably very high in absorption, already have an inner world which is probably pretty vivid. And they are very actively trying to suspend their disbelief, and they are trying to create characters. And when many writers, not all writers, but and particularly fiction, when many fiction writers, when they talk about their characters, they talk about their characters as having their own minds and agency. So they and they will say that they're more, at least some of them will say that happens only when the story is relatively well developed. But they'll say things like, oh, Louisiana wanted me to write a story about her, so I just had to. Or, my character wasn't behaving, so I had to change the quality, the direction of the plot. So that's something, and that's often very compelling and quite useful, because the writer is trying to create a vivid imaginative world which feels real, and the more active and independent the character can be, the more powerful it is. People sometimes will say, I've talked to somebody who said, oh, her character was Jazz. When Jazz was telling me what to say, I just wrote it down. When I had to develop the character by myself, that was much harder. So there's that quality. The tulpomancer world is a very social world. These are people who start out with no sense that they're doing anything supernatural. They go into this chat room. They hear that you can develop this imaginary companion. They have lots of social interaction about this. So they teach each other how to do this. There are many manuals about how to do it online. They start and they describe a trajectory through which their tulpa, their character, starts to feel more and more like it's its own agent. Because of the social nature of that world, the tulpas can interact. Because the tulpas tell that this is a very internet-heavy world. People are spending hours online. There are these special chat rooms where humans are online and they're chatting to each other, and then their tulpa will tell the human what to write as them. Or sometimes their tulpa will take over the body. That's a complicated story we haven't spoken about. And then the tulpas are interacting with each other. And there's also a certain amount of social management about when the tulpa is out of line. These tulpas I don't think we should allow in the chat room. So there's that kind of social shaping. Does that speak to your question? Okay.
Yes, so we do have one online question. Can you give an example of the violences you speak of finding in the voices in American receivers versus other cultures?
I can repeat it. The mic is mumbling it a little bit.
Yes, sorry. Can you give an example of the violences you speak of finding in the voices in American receivers versus other cultures?
Oh, a lot of these American folks heard things like kill, stab, jump. So they're quite, it's not subtle violence. It is, and the way we coded it, is there a command to hurt the self or another? And often it's a very violent hurt. One example is, see that bus? You should have jumped in front of that bus. You should have jumped then. You should have jumped out of the window. You should have jumped then. I don't like these voices that tell me to put a knife in someone's eye. So I want to be pretty clear that this does not mean that it's wonderful to have schizophrenia in Chennai and in Accra, right? So one of the men I spoke to who heard God speaking to him had also murdered his sister. So it's not a straightforward story, but it is probably true that if you can force a psychotic voice into a social relationship, you're probably a little bit more able to get it to behave properly. I see a hurried consultation about an online question behind. Okay. Oh, okay. Wait, don't we have till 1, but. Oh, I have. Yeah.
Thank you for a really interesting talk. I wanted to touch on one of the last things you said when we talk about sort of approaches to integrate and change our relationships to voices in our modern day U.S. context, and the work of therapy, specifically in the context of psychedelic therapies that are kind of experiencing a boom right now in the U.S., and they're often, mystical experiences and very much enshrouded in these like voice hearing experiences. Yeah. And I was wondering what kind of role that you potentially saw for that therapy in sort of breaking down, because I feel like most of our ideas around therapy in terms of changing our relationships and trying to cultivate more positive inner conceptions of voices are rational sort of approaches and cognitive or behavioral ones versus a more faith-based or mystical almost spiritual approach. And what kind of, if any, promise did you see?
It's a really interesting question about the role of these drug ayahuasca practices or other drug mushroom therapies, in which they're often very social and very therapeutic, often explicitly therapeutic, and in which the person is invited. So I know the ayahuasca world best, although I know it this much, not very much. So the person is invited to go to a retreat. There are teachers at the retreat telling them who to listen for, the voice of to hear the plant singing, and they are often instructing them what the correct voice is. So this is a colleague of mine, David Dupuy, who's written about this. So there's this kind of honing, culling process that the teacher does, and the person who is consuming the plant is encouraged to sort of develop this positive relationship with the plant, and then to learn something from the plant. I think those approaches are pretty powerful. They are, I am struck that some of them are a little bit more out of the Wild West than others. So I know of one practice in which actually a Ghanaian shaman would take people with psychosis into the hills of Santa Cruz and just give them a lot of cocaine and let them. That seemed like a really bad idea, and there are and I tend to think that ongoing social relationships are pretty helpful. So one-off experiences are probably a little less helpful than ongoing relationships with a teacher, and and of course, one of the things that's true about any mind-altering drugs is that many of them increase the risk of psychosis. It's a pretty small risk, but it's a pretty significant risk. So I think if somebody were vulnerable to psychosis, that's also a little bit risky. Other than that, they're kind of great. And so, I think they're quite great. And people have used different versions of substances to create a mentor, a spirit mentor, to relax their terror of death, to relax their terror of cancer treatment. They've been quite profoundly useful. Just want to be careful. You can choose the wrong therapist too, and you can absolutely wander into the wrong church. And it's no question about that.
Do you have one more question in you?
Sure.
It looks like it's going to be the ancient world that has the last word.
Okay.
Partly. So thank you so much for this absolutely fantastic talk. Yeah, it was extremely enjoyable. So my question is relates to the following issue, and that is, did you perhaps observe any differences between individual experiences of hearing voices versus group experiences of hearing the same voice? Did you have any cases where two or more people claimed that they have heard something or experienced the same auditory kind of a thing, and that they interpreted it in the same fashion? And the reason why I'm asking is that, yes, indeed, Sonam, in some Greek cults, we do have stories about people hearing divine voice, but people are not entirely certain what it means, and then there are differing interpretations of what was heard. Thank you so much.
Yeah, okay, great question. Is there a group process in which different people hear the same voice? So in the Christian setting, in the church where I was, in the churches where I spent a lot of time, there was often a sense that there was one God who was speaking, but it was filtered through the stuff of human minds, right? And you could be mistaken. So there were lots of jokes. My favorite joke was once I was at the church. There's this young woman at the front of the church. She's talking in a very soulful manner about how she needs to go to Puerto Vallarta to do missionary work, lovely part of Mexico, and really the church should support her in this mission work. And the guy next to me leaned over and said, "Boy, God sure likes a lot of missionary work done in Puerto Vallarta, doesn't he?" And so there's this real sense that somebody can be wrong. They can be driven by their own selfish, self-interested motives. There was a real sense in that church that because people could be wrong, you should get many people to listen to God around the same issue. And absolutely there were disagreements. But one of the woman who said start a school, said that God told her to start a school, found herself at one point without a job and without a roommate. So she couldn't afford her apartment. And maybe she had some kind of job, but it wasn't a very good job. And she wanted to know whether God wanted her to stay in the apartment, which she couldn't really afford, or or get a different apartment. And so she was asking her friends to pray for her and then report back to her what they were experiencing. So they would give her different images, and she was sort of coming to a conclusion. And she came to what I thought was the wrong conclusion, but that's just me. But that's what she was doing. She was trying to get other people to hear. And there is, it really depends on the theology. With the Akomfu, you have one God. It's not quite true. Sometimes there are multiple gods, but different Akomfu talking to the same God. But there are a lot of little gods. In a church, you've got one God, and that God has different advice for different members of the church. But if there's something, but he's going to be consistent. He should be consistent in his point of view about any particular questions. There are always, the simple rule of thumb for young people new people coming to the prayer team, and for anyone on the prayer team was never prophesy about birth, death, or marriage. It's too risky, you could be wrong, and then people get too excited.
That's a lovely note, I think, to pause. And will you please join me in thanking Professor Luhrmann for a wonderful start to this workshop. Remember, we have 2 more events tomorrow. Please feel free to register or come in person or join us online. And thank you again for your presence.
And thank you for the great questions.